You walked outside one morning, and something was different. You couldn't name it immediately. The yard looked the same. The feeders were where you left them. But the birds, they weren't your birds. A bird sat on the fence you'd never noticed before. Another moved through the shrubs near the back corner, quick and low, in a color you weren't expecting. You stood still without deciding to. And then, you saw a third. You went back inside and thought about it for the rest of the day. What you saw that morning wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't your imagination. What you witnessed was the edge of one of the largest coordinated movements on Earth, a migration wave passing directly over your address, briefly touching down in your yard on its way to somewhere you will never go. And the birds you saw were not lost, not confused, and not staying. They were travelers. And for reasons I'm going to explain, your yard was exactly what they were looking for. If you've ever stood in your backyard and felt like something was happening that you didn't have the words for, keep watching, because you were right. And by the end of this video, you will know exactly what you saw, why it happened in your yard specifically, and what it tells you about the invisible world your property sits inside of every single year. Subscribe before we go further. What you're about to learn will change the way you look at every ordinary morning for the rest of your life. Most people think of bird migration the way they think of the seasons: gradual, spread out, vaguely happening somewhere in the distance. A slow drift southward in autumn, a slow return in spring, a background process, like weather. That is almost entirely wrong. Migration, as scientists now understand it, moves in pulses. Enormous, compressed, rapid pulses triggered by specific atmospheric conditions, riding specific wind patterns, often concentrating millions of birds into a single 24-hour window over a defined geographic corridor. Researchers at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, using a continental network of weather surveillance radars repurposed to detect biological targets, have documented nights when over 300 million individual birds were aloft simultaneously over North America. In a single night. Moving together, invisibly, at altitudes between 500 and 5,000 feet, directly above cities, suburbs, and backyards like yours. The Birdcast project a collaboration between Cornell, the University of Massachusetts, and Colorado State has been mapping these pulses in real time for years now. What they found upended how scientists think about migration timing. It isn't a season. It is a series of events. Peak nights, threshold crossings. On certain nights in spring and fall, the skies above a single metropolitan area can carry more than 1 million migrants in transit. The morning after one of those nights, those birds land. They land wherever they can, in parks, in vacant lots, along creek banks, in any green space that offers cover and food. And for the birds that pass over suburban neighborhoods with mature trees and understory shrubs and running water, they land in yards like yours. What you saw that morning wasn't a curiosity. It was the aftermath of a mass transit event. Your yard was the rest stop. Here is what nobody explains about migration fallout, because most people don't know it happens at all. When a wave of migrants comes down in the morning, they do not distribute themselves evenly. They do not scatter randomly across a suburb like seeds in the wind. They concentrate. They select. And the factors that pull them toward one yard over the next are specific, measurable, and, if you know what you're looking for, visible in your own property right now. The first factor is canopy continuity. Migrating birds, when they descend at dawn, are scanning the landscape from above for corridors of green. A yard with a mature tree, especially a native oak, maple, or elm registers as a resource node in a way that a lawn-dominated yard simply doesn't. Dr. Douglas Tallamy at the University of Delaware has spent years documenting the insect biomass supported by native versus non-native trees. A single native oak supports over 500 species of caterpillars and other invertebrates. An ornamental non-native may support fewer than 5. For a migrating warbler that has been flying all night and needs to refuel in the next 3 hours, the difference between those two trees is not aesthetic. It is survival. The second factor is structural layering. Migrants don't use a yard like a parking lot. They move through it vertically foraging, in leaf litter, in the shrub layer, in the mid-canopy, in the treetops. A yard that offers multiple layers of vegetation is, to a migrating bird, the difference between a gas station and a full-service hotel. One offers bare minimum. The other offers everything they need to continue the journey. The third factor is water. Moving water specifically. A bird bath is good. A bird bath with a dripper or a pump water that makes sound is something else entirely. Migrating birds locate water by sound before they locate it by sight. If your yard was dripping or running that morning, they heard it from the air. Your yard wasn't chosen randomly. It was chosen because it offered something measurable. Something your yard earned. Now let's talk about the birds themselves. Because the ones you saw that morning, the ones you didn't recognize, were not exotic or rare in the absolute sense. They were ordinary birds. Just not your ordinary birds. Migration creates what birders call a fallout. And a fallout, when it happens over a suburban yard, deposits species that have no business being there on a normal day. In spring, it might be warblers 15. 20 species that breed in the boreal forests of Canada and spend their winters in Central America, touching down in Ohio or Missouri or Pennsylvania for a single morning before continuing north. In fall, the composition shifts sparrows, thrushes, vireos, flycatchers, moving southward, pausing where the landscape allows. The reason you didn't recognize them is straightforward. They don't live here. They pass through. And their window of presence in any given yard can be as short as a few hours long enough to eat, drink, and rest, and then they're gone. By mid-morning, most of them will have moved on. By noon, your yard will look like your yard again. The birds you saw at 7 a.m. will be 30 miles south by afternoon. Ornithologists at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center have tracked individual migrants using light-level geolocators and, more recently, nanotag transmitters through the MODIS wildlife tracking system. What the data shows is startling. Birds that appear to be resting are often making complex decisions. They are assessing fat reserves, reading barometric pressure, evaluating the vegetation quality of where they've landed. A migrating warbler sitting still on a branch is not resting passively. It is computing. The bird on your fence that morning was not lost. It was working. And your yard passed its assessment. Most people have never been told that their home has a geographic identity in the context of migration, that the specific coordinates of your property place it inside something larger, a flyway, a corridor, a mapped and studied highway in the sky that has existed for thousands of years before your house was built. North America has 4 major flyways: the Atlantic, the Mississippi, the Central, and the Pacific. These are not lines on a map. They are living systems shaped by topography, prevailing winds, coastlines, river valleys, and mountain ridges that compress or funnel birds into predictable paths across the continent. If your home sits near a river corridor, along a ridgeline, at the edge of a lake, or in a region where 2 habitat types meet an ecotone, in ecological terms, your yard may sit inside a migration concentration zone without you ever having known it. Researchers at the American Bird Conservancy, working with radar data and banding station records, have identified thousands of stopover sites across the continent locations where migrants reliably congregate during peak movement. Many of these sites are not wildlife refuges. They are parks, greenways, suburban neighborhoods, even individual properties that happen to offer the right combination of food, water, and cover in the right geographic position. Your property, in the morning you saw those unfamiliar birds, functioned as one of those sites. It may do so every year. It may have been doing so every year since the trees in your yard reached a certain height, since your garden developed a certain density, since your water feature started running in April. And you may have been the first person in your household to actually see it. Most people walk past their yard on those mornings without stopping. They glance at the feeder, register that something looks different, and go back inside. They miss it. You didn't. Here is the part most migration coverage leaves out entirely: what the birds that paused in your yard actually needed, and whether your yard gave it to them. Migrating birds arrive in a state of managed depletion. They have burned through fat reserves through the night's flight. Their muscle tissue has been under sustained metabolic stress. They are, by any physiological measure, running low, and the window they have to refuel before continuing in either direction, north or south, depending on the season, is narrow. They need high-calorie food, fast, and the fastest, most calorie-dense food available in a yard isn't seed. It's insects. This is the finding that most backyard birders find genuinely surprising. Warblers, thrushes, vireos, flycatchers, the majority of long-distance migrants are insectivores. They are not coming to your seed feeder. They are moving through your trees, your shrubs, your leaf litter, hunting the insects and larvae that live there. The capacity of your yard to support them during a fallout is directly proportional to the insect life your yard contains, which is directly proportional to the native plant species your yard supports. Dr. Talamy's research at Delaware made this concrete in a way that changed how conservation organizations talk about private land. His team calculated that if homeowners across the eastern United States converted just 10% of their lawn to native plantings, the aggregate insect biomass produced would be sufficient to support breeding bird populations at a scale equivalent to a major wildlife preserve. 10%. The math works at the individual yard level too. A yard with even a few native shrubs, a serviceberry, a spicebush, a native viburnum, supports orders of magnitude more insect life than a yard planted entirely in ornamentals. The birds that stopped in your yard that morning found what they found. What they find next year depends, in small but real ways, on decisions you make between now and then. There is a concept in migration biology called stopover ecology, the study of what happens to birds between their departure point and their destination. For decades, ornithologists focused almost exclusively on the endpoints of migration: the breeding grounds, the wintering grounds. The journey in between was treated as a logistical connector, a means to an end. That changed when researchers began to realize that what happens at stopovers doesn't just affect whether birds complete the journey. It affects whether they breed successfully when they arrive, whether they survive the following winter, whether they return at all. A study published in the journal The Auk tracked individual wood thrushes, a species whose population has declined by nearly 60% since 1966, according to Partners in Flight data using geolocators across multiple migration seasons. The findings were unambiguous. Birds that had access to high-quality stopover habitat arrived at their breeding grounds earlier, in better condition, and produced more young. The stopover wasn't incidental to their survival. It was central to it. This is what your yard was doing on that morning. Quietly, without fanfare, without anyone watching it, was functioning as a link in a chain that connects boreal forests in Canada to tropical forests in Central America. Your property was part of something that spans 8,000 miles. The birds that passed through were not extras in the background of your morning. They were the main event of a biological system so large it can only be seen from space. And it touched down in your yard. Once you know what a fallout looks like, you will not miss the next one. But knowing when to look, that's the part most people never learn. The single most reliable predictor of a migration fallout is a wind shift. Migrants prefer to fly with a tailwind. In spring, the ideal conditions are southerly winds that carry birds northward. When a cold front moves through and switches those winds to the north, birds that were aloft will descend. They have no choice. Flying into a headwind burns energy at a rate they cannot sustain, so they land, in large numbers, wherever the landscape receives them. The morning after a cold front in April or May, in the eastern half of the continent, is one of the most reliable times to find migrating species in your yard. In fall, the logic reverses. A cold front brings northerly winds the tailwind that carries birds south. The night of the front, millions may be flying. The morning after, if the front stalled or if a second system is behind it, they may be grounded in your yard for a day or more. The Birdcast website, maintained by Cornell, with radar maps updated in near real time, publishes migration forecasts for the entire continental United States. They show, by region, by night, the predicted intensity of migration overhead. A high migration night followed by an unfavorable morning means a fallout is likely. Cornell's team has made this data publicly accessible in a format that requires no scientific background to read. On a high migration night, go to bed early. Be outside before dawn. Have your coffee in the yard, not at the kitchen table. The birds will come down at first light, and you will be there when they do. I want to close with something that I think matters more than anything else in this video. More than the radar data, more than the flyway maps, more than the insect biomass numbers. Something that I think you already felt the morning you stood in your yard and couldn't look away. You were not a bystander to what happened that morning. You were part of the infrastructure. Migration is one of the last truly wild things left on this planet at scale. It is older than any civilization, older than any map, older than the borders we've drawn across the land it crosses every year. It is a biological imperative so powerful that a 4-inch bird will launch itself off a tree branch in coastal New England in October and fly non-stop for 80 hours over open ocean to reach the Yucatan Peninsula, a journey documented by radar and confirmed by transmitter data that still makes ornithologists stop mid-sentence when they describe it. The drive is not metaphorical. It is written into the bird's genome, regulated by day length and hormones and the magnetic field of the earth, and it is passing over your home every spring and every fall, whether you're watching or not. But here is what changes when you do watch. When you put out water. When you let a corner of the yard go a little wild. When you plant one serviceberry and let the leaf litter accumulate under the oak. When you stand still on a Tuesday morning because something in the yard looked different, and you wanted to know why. You are not just a witness to migration. You are a node in the network. A rest stop on the longest journey on Earth. The birds that landed in your yard that morning were following a route their ancestors flew before yours arrived on this continent. They weren't visiting you. They were passing through something ancient that you now happen to be part of. And the fact that you noticed, that you stood still, that you paid attention, that you felt something you couldn't fully name, means that the relationship between your yard and that ancient route is no longer invisible. You walked outside one morning, and something was different. Now you know what it was. I want to know about your fallout morning. The morning you walked outside and the birds were wrong different species, unexpected colors, birds you'd never seen before and haven't seen since. Tell me in the comments what you saw and when it happened. If you're not sure what they were, describe them someone watching will know. The people in this community have seen things in their yards that belong in field journals. I'd like to hear yours.